Imagine walking through the busy terminal of a bustling international airport, excited for your upcoming trip. You're a proud family of four, with dreams of a relaxing vacation or an important business meeting ahead. After a long flight, you're ready to unwind before your next leg of the journey. As you approach the VIP lounge, expecting a peaceful retreat, the unthinkable happens. The staff looks at you, eyes cold, as they inform you that you're not allowed entry. What could have gone wrong? Your family has done everything right. Your tickets are in order, your behavior has been impeccable, and you followed every rule. But the truth is even more shocking. It's not a mistake, and it's not a misunderstanding. The reason for the refusal is something you never expected to face in this day and age: your skin color. This is exactly what happened to the Johnson family during a routine layover at a major airport, a moment that would soon become a viral sensation. The Johnsons, a well-traveled, successful black family, was suddenly thrust into a situation that no one should ever have to experience. As they stood in disbelief, struggling to comprehend what was happening, they found themselves being turned away from the VIP lounge, a space usually reserved for those willing to pay a little more for a moment of peace. What makes this story even more surprising is that it didn't end there. Just when the situation seemed hopeless, something extraordinary happened. The story of the Johnson family's unfair treatment quickly spread, and a celebrity, someone who had once walked the same terminals, who knew all too well the pressures of fame and privilege, took notice. A well-known public figure, someone who had experienced their own share of struggles and triumphs, walked into the scene at the exact right moment. What happens next? How does a celebrity use their influence to change the course of a story that seemed doomed from the start? And what does this encounter reveal about the larger issues of discrimination and privilege that still exist today in places we'd never expect? Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about fairness, power, and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right. Just when it seemed like the Johnsons would be forgotten, this celebrity's involvement would spark a whirlwind of controversy, making headlines around the world. But how would it all end? Will the Johnson family get the justice they deserve, or will this incident be swept under the rug? Keep watching, because this is only the beginning. The Johnson family was no stranger to travel. As a family of four, they had ventured across the globe, visiting places they had dreamed of and achieving the kind of success many could only aspire to. Mr. Johnson, the father, worked as a senior executive at a well-known tech company, often flying for business. His wife, Mrs. Johnson, was a lawyer with a growing reputation in her field, balancing her career with raising their two children, who were both bright and hardworking. They had all grown accustomed to the rhythm of airport terminals, the rush of boarding passes, and the familiarity of VIP lounges that offered a moment of calm between the chaos of flights. That morning was no different, or so they thought. After a long flight from their home city to a connecting hub, they had one more leg to go before reaching their destination. Exhausted but relieved to be almost there, the Johnsons eagerly walked toward the VIP lounge, hoping to relax before their next flight. With their premium tickets in hand, they thought they would be able to enjoy the comforts that came with that status. After all, they had paid the price for it, just like countless other travelers who were able to rest in peace and comfort while waiting for their flights. But as they approached the door to the lounge, something felt off. The atmosphere was tense. The receptionist, a woman in her early 30s with cold, distant eyes, looked at them as they approached. She didn't greet them, didn't offer a smile. Instead, she simply pointed to a sign on the wall behind her, saying, "VIP entry is restricted." The Johnsons were confused. Mr. Johnson stepped forward, holding out his ticket, expecting the usual scan and welcome. But when the receptionist looked at the ticket, her face barely shifted. She barely glanced at the ticket before shaking her head. "You can't go in," she said. The words were simple, but they hit hard. Mr. Johnson repeated the question, unsure of what was going on. "I'm sorry, but we've booked the VIP lounge, and we have the right to enter." The receptionist was unmoved. She looked at him with a look that he couldn't quite read, then glanced over to her colleagues, who were watching from the corner of the lounge. "I said you can't enter. Please step aside." Confusion quickly turned into frustration and then into disbelief. Mrs. Johnson asked the receptionist once again why they were being denied access, to which the woman responded with the same cold tone, "There are rules, and you don't meet the requirements." The couple exchanged worried looks. They had traveled enough to know that VIP lounges didn't have that many restrictions. There were occasional limits based on flight status or the class of ticket purchased. They had done everything right. So what was the real reason? By now, the couple's 2 children, Jaden and Maya, had grown restless, not understanding the situation. Jaden, at 10 years old, was the more outspoken of the two, and he had begun asking the receptionist, "Why can't we go in? We paid for it." But the woman ignored him completely, offering no answer. Feeling the frustration rising, Mr. Johnson pulled out his phone to call customer service, but just as he was about to dial, the situation took an even more bizarre turn. One of the staff members, someone he hadn't noticed before, appeared from behind a curtain and walked straight up to the counter. A man in his late 40s, dressed sharply in a suit that screamed authority, stood in front of them. He looked at the Johnsons, his eyes scanning them quickly before settling on Mr. Johnson's face. "You can't go in," the man said, before any explanation was given. His voice was firm, but with a level of condescension that made it clear he wasn't offering an option. Mr. Johnson, now feeling the full weight of what was happening, took a step back. The uncertainty was turning into something darker, something much more unsettling. He looked around, and for the first time, he realized that there were a few other guests who had been allowed entry into the lounge. They were all white. The thought lingered in his mind. Could this have anything to do with their race? At first, he dismissed it. Surely that couldn't be the reason. In this day and age, such blatant discrimination seemed unimaginable. But the more he thought about it, the more the pieces started to align. The cool indifference of the receptionist, the sudden appearance of the authoritative figure, unannounced. The other passengers lounging inside, none of them looked like they were being questioned. They weren't being told to step aside. Mrs. Johnson, sensing that things were quickly spiraling, attempted to diffuse the tension. She calmly explained the situation to the staff, reiterating that they had the appropriate tickets for lounge access. But the more she spoke, the more she realized that their efforts were futile. The staff wasn't interested in hearing their side. The man in the suit offered no explanation. "Rules are rules," he repeated, but his words felt hollow. The situation was escalating, and despite their polite persistence, nothing changed. It was then that Mrs. Johnson noticed something unexpected, a familiar face walking past them. A man who, despite his unassuming demeanor, carried a quiet sense of confidence. A face she recognized from television, social media, and tabloid gossip. It was Damon King, an actor, entrepreneur, and philanthropist who had made a name for himself through his roles in blockbuster films and his involvement in various social causes. He was known for being outspoken about inequality and for using his platform to advocate for change. When Damon King looked up and saw the tense scene unfolding in front of him, his eyes immediately locked onto the Johnson family. He paused for a moment, as if trying to process what he was seeing. Mrs. Johnson's heart skipped a beat. She knew that King had been vocal about issues like racial inequality and discrimination, and something told her that he had noticed what was happening. Without hesitation, Damon approached the counter. He greeted the staff with a firm nod and then turned his gaze toward the Johnsons. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying the authority of someone used to standing his ground. The staff faltered for a moment, unsure how to respond to someone of his stature. But before they could speak, Damon's eyes narrowed, his attention focused on the VIP lounge manager. "Are you telling me that this family isn't allowed entry to the lounge because of a technicality?" The manager shifted uncomfortably, not knowing how to react to the celebrity's direct question. The atmosphere in the terminal grew heavier. Mrs. Johnson felt a flicker of hope. Would Damon King, The man who had the power to sway public opinion with a single tweet be able to bring some justice to the situation? Or was this just another empty gesture that would make headlines and fade away with time? The tension hung in the air, unanswered. Would Damon's involvement make a difference? Or would the staff hold their ground, leaving the Johnson family's dignity in tatters? The unanswered questions loomed over them as the scene stood poised on the edge of something bigger. Damon King's entrance into the scene shifted the atmosphere in the lounge dramatically. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting for him to speak or do something that would change the course of the interaction. Mrs. Johnson felt a mixture of relief and uncertainty. She had seen celebrities use that influence for good before, but she also knew how easily such moments could be dismissed. What if Damon King's involvement was just a fleeting moment in the spotlight? What if, despite his power, nothing changed for them? Damon stood firm, his gaze unwavering as he faced the lounge manager, who seemed taken aback by the unexpected confrontation. The manager shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable under the scrutiny of a high-profile public figure. He stammered, trying to maintain his composure. "There are rules, sir. We can't let them in because..." "Because of what?" Damon's voice cut through the manager's words with a sharpness that made everyone pause. "What exactly is the reason you're denying this family access to something they've paid for?" The manager hesitated. His eyes flickered toward the receptionist, who was nervously glancing between Damon and the family. The air was thick with tension. It was obvious to anyone watching that something didn't sit right, but no one was willing to acknowledge it openly. Not yet, at least. The silence was broken by a soft voice, barely audible but cutting through the tension. "It's because they're black, isn't it?" It came from Maya, the Johnsons' daughter, who had been standing quietly by her mother's side. Her innocent, yet piercing question hung in the air, and for a moment, the entire group seemed frozen in place. It was a question that, no matter how uncomfortable, felt like the truth that no one had dared to say out loud. Damon looked down at the young girl, his expression softening. He nodded, his eyes briefly flashing with an emotion that was hard to read. Was it empathy, anger, or something deeper? He crouched down to Maya's level and spoke in a voice that was both calm and filled with conviction. "Sometimes the rules aren't what they seem, but that doesn't make them right." Mrs. Johnson, taken aback by her daughter's boldness, pulled her closer, trying to shield her from the heaviness of the situation. But Maya's question had already put the spotlight on the ugly truth they had all been dancing around. The tension between the Johnson family and the staff was no longer just about a misunderstanding. It was about something far more sinister, an uncomfortable truth that society still struggled to face head-on. The fact that this incident was unfolding in the public eye only made it worse, and Damon King's presence seemed to amplify the power dynamics at play. The manager, now visibly sweating under the pressure, turned to one of his colleagues for support. The other staff members had begun to murmur amongst themselves, uncertain of how to handle a situation involving a celebrity and, more importantly, a family whose rights were being questioned. The manager, unwilling to make a decision that could lead to further scrutiny, stepped away from the counter and walked toward a back office. "I'll need to check with my supervisor," he said, though his voice lacked the certainty it had moments earlier. With the manager retreating, the room seemed to take a collective sigh of relief, but only for a moment. The Johnsons were still left standing in front of the lounge, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. Their journey, which had started with excitement and anticipation, now felt like a bitter reminder of the world they still lived in, a world where their success and status didn't seem to matter in the face of systemic prejudice. Damon turned to the family, his voice quieter now, as he offered a sense of solidarity. "Don't let them make you feel small," he said, his words heavy with the experience of someone who had been in their shoes in different forms throughout his career. "We'll get to the bottom of this, don't worry." But the Johnsons weren't sure whether they should feel grateful or more disillusioned. Was Damon King just another celebrity using his moment of influence for a fleeting cause? Or would he genuinely make a difference? Would the airport staff truly listen? Or would they dismiss this as just another incident involving a famous person? The uncertainty gnawed at them, amplifying their frustration. Meanwhile, the staff behind the scenes were quietly deliberating. The conversation had moved from the public confrontation in the lounge to a more private discussion in the manager's office. The situation had escalated quickly, and now they had to figure out how to address the growing pressure from all sides. One of the staff members, a young woman who had been quietly observing the situation, finally spoke up. "We can't just let it slide, can we? If this gets out, it'll be bad for the airport's reputation." Her voice was anxious, but there was an undercurrent of concern that seemed genuine. The supervisor, a middle-aged man with a look of exhaustion on his face, rubbed his temples. "I don't know. If we let them in now, it could cause more problems. We have to consider the bigger picture. There's too much at stake." But another staff member, an older man who had been in the industry for decades, shook his head. "If we don't do something now, it'll be even worse." That kid said what we all know. "The problem's been here for a long time, but we've just been turning a blind eye." As the discussion in the back office continued, Damon King stood with the Johnsons, refusing to leave their side. "They'll have to make a decision soon," he said. "They can't keep you out forever." But as the minutes dragged on, a sense of dread began to creep back into the situation. No one knew which way it would go, and the longer it took, the more it felt like the outcome could go either way. And then, just when they thought they might finally get an answer, the unexpected happened. Another figure walked into the lounge, a woman in a business suit, her posture straight, her presence commanding. She was tall, with sharp features and an air of authority that immediately drew attention. It was the airport's chief diversity officer. Her arrival only added to the sense of tension that was already building in the room. She walked straight toward Damon and the Johnson family, her eyes scanning the situation with an air of professionalism, but also something more, an understanding of the dynamics at play. She glanced at the staff and then spoke, her voice firm. "What's going on here?" The answer to that question was still hanging in the air, waiting to be revealed. The moment the chief diversity officer walked into the lounge, everything seemed to freeze. She carried an air of authority that immediately shifted the dynamic. Her sharp eyes scanned the room quickly, taking in the tense faces of the staff, the discomfort in the air, and the Johnson family standing at the center of it all. Damon King remained calm but visibly alert, standing beside the Johnsons as if silently promising them that he wouldn't back down now. She glanced at the manager, who was still hovering by the counter, and then looked at the receptionist, her gaze piercing as if she could see straight through them. "What is the situation here?" she asked, her voice controlled but firm. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure of how to proceed with someone of her position in the room. The manager, who had hoped the matter would resolve itself quickly, stepped forward with an expression that bordered on panic. "It's just that. They don't meet the criteria for lounge entry," he said, his voice faltering under the scrutiny of the chief diversity officer. "But we've paid for access," Mrs. Johnson interjected, her voice trembling with frustration. "We have the tickets, the rights. Why are we being treated like this?" Her words carried a mixture of disbelief and anger, and the longer the situation went unresolved, the more her composure started to crack. The officer's gaze softened slightly as she turned to the Johnsons. She had seen this before, families being subjected to rules that weren't applied fairly, being made to feel like they didn't belong simply because of their race. It was a quiet form of discrimination that many people dismissed, but it was one that still lingered in spaces like this, where power dynamics were quietly enforced behind closed doors. "Are you telling me that this family is being denied lounge access because of arbitrary rules?" she asked, her voice colder now, addressing the manager directly. "What exactly are these criteria that you keep referring to?" The manager opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing the weight of his position. The tension in the air was suffocating. Everything in the room seemed to hang on the edge of a knife. The Johnsons exchanged glances, hoping that the intervention of someone in power would be enough to resolve the situation. But as they stood there, a sinking feeling crept over them. What if they were wrong? What if nothing changed? The air felt thick with the unspoken, an invisible line that separated them from everyone else in the room. Damon stood a few steps away, watching the chief diversity officer's every move, his eyes narrowed. He knew that there was no turning back now. This wasn't just about getting access to a lounge anymore. It was about confronting something much bigger. This was a chance to shine a light on a problem that had existed for years but was so often ignored. The officer glanced at the staff again, her expression unreadable, before taking a few measured steps toward the Johnson family. She looked them over, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, their 2 children, their faces filled with a quiet resolve, even as their frustration bubbled just beneath the surface. She could feel the weight of their uncertainty, the way the situation had slowly turned into a moment that might define their entire trip. The quiet murmurs among the staff grew louder, as if they were all waiting for the officer's next move. The air felt like it might explode at any moment. Then, in a sudden shift, she turned to Damon King. "Mr. King," she said, her tone steady, "I believe you've been trying to make sure that this family is treated fairly." Damon nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "Yes, I've seen this kind of thing before, and I'm not going to stand by and let it happen again." His voice had a weight to it now, each word measured but full of determination. The officer gave him a small nod, acknowledging his stance, and then returned her attention to the staff. "You've made a mistake," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who wasn't afraid to speak out. "This family has every right to be here. You'll correct this immediately." But the staff seemed unsure. The manager shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting from the officer to the Johnsons, and then to the lounge door, as if waiting for something, some kind of confirmation that this was all part of a larger plan. Just as the situation reached its boiling point, a voice from the back of the room broke the tension. "Excuse me." All eyes turned to see a woman in a business suit entering the lounge, her presence commanding attention the moment she stepped through the door. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her eyes sharp and observant as she surveyed the room. She was calm, almost unnervingly so, but there was something in her stance that hinted she wasn't just another corporate figure walking in to smooth things over. She was the airport's CEO, the one person who could make decisions that would ripple through the entire system. The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. The staff visibly stiffened, recognizing the weight of the CEO's presence. The CEO walked directly toward the chief diversity officer and Damon King, giving the Johnson family a quick, yet telling glance. She stood beside them, the air shifting again, and for the first time there was a palpable sense that something was about to break. The CEO's eyes locked with the manager, who immediately stiffened under her gaze. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice low, but carrying an undeniable authority. The manager, flustered, stammered out a response. We had a situation with this family. They weren't allowed entry, but we were just following procedure." "Procedure," the CEO repeated, her tone cold. "And what procedure is that? Because, from where I'm standing, I see a family who has paid for access, and I see a group of people who are questioning their right to use it." There was a tense silence as the weight of her words sank in. The CEO looked at the chief diversity officer, then back at the staff, her gaze unwavering. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened, is it?" The staff shifted uncomfortably, and the manager's face flushed a deep red. The truth was starting to unravel, and with every passing moment, it seemed that the stakes were getting higher. Damon glanced at the Johnsons, then at the CEO. He could sense the impending shift, but he also knew this was just the beginning. No one would be leaving this terminal the same way they had come in. As the tension in the lounge escalated and the CEO's eyes remained locked on the staff, a subtle shift in the room went unnoticed at first. The murmurs of the employees grew quieter, their voices muffled by the intensity of the standoff. For a moment, it seemed as though the CEO's presence was enough to break the dam of silence and force everyone into compliance. But just when it seemed like the situation might finally turn in favor of the Johnson family, a new voice, low and measured, cut through the growing tension like a blade. "Is this really necessary?" The voice came from behind the CEO, and it was unmistakable. It was the voice of someone who clearly didn't want to be part of this unfolding drama, yet his presence seemed to loom larger than ever. Damon King's face tightened as he turned, his eyes locking on the man who had just stepped forward. It was none other than the airport's major investor, a man known for his connections in the corporate world and his aggressive stance on business decisions. His name was Henry Stone, and he was the last person anyone in the room expected to show up. Henry's reputation was that of someone who played hardball, who never let anything disrupt his carefully crafted image of success. He was powerful, influential, and completely out of place in this kind of scenario. But there he was, his crisp suit and confident demeanor commanding attention, as he slowly approached a CEO and the gathering crowd. "I'm not sure this is the right place to make a scene," Henry continued, his tone cool and detached. He glanced at the Johnson family as if they were an afterthought, then turned his gaze back to the CEO. "We've got bigger things to focus on today. We can't afford to lose sight of our priorities over something as trivial as a lounge dispute." The room went deathly quiet. Mrs. Johnson's breath caught in her throat. She had heard of Henry Stone before. His name was often associated with big business deals, mergers, and making difficult decisions. But this was different. This wasn't just a matter of business. It was a question of human dignity, of rights being trampled underfoot. And his words seemed like a cold, calculated move to dismiss everything they were standing up for. Damon King, whose face had been stoic up until that point, suddenly tensed. He moved forward, standing between Henry Stone and the CEO, his expression fierce. "This is not about business, Mr. Stone," he said, his voice low but filled with undeniable power. "This is about a family's right to be treated fairly. You don't get to push this aside just because you think you're untouchable." Henry met Damon's gaze, his lips curling into a slight, almost patronizing smile. "You can make all the noise you want, Damon. But at the end of the day, people like us don't need to explain ourselves to people like them," he said, his words dripping with condescension. The tension in the room shot through the roof. The Johnsons stood there, stunned by the sheer audacity of his comment, while the staff exchanged nervous glances. The CEO, for the first time, looked caught between two opposing forces. She had always been a pragmatist, understanding the complex webs of corporate loyalty, but even she couldn't ignore the growing chaos. Damon's fists clenched, but before he could say anything further, the chief diversity officer stepped forward, her voice calm yet undeniably forceful. "Mr. Stone, I'm not sure you understand what's at stake here. You may think this is trivial, but to these people, it's their dignity. You can't buy that with money or influence." Henry Stone smirked. "Dignity? Let's be real here. What do we really accomplish by dragging this out? You're not going to change anything by letting this family sit in the lounge." He turned to the manager, his voice now taking on a different tone, as if trying to regain control. "Let's just move on and get back to normal, shall we? There's no need to make this worse." Damon's eyes flashed, his anger rising at the man's dismissive attitude. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice colder than before. "This isn't about a lounge or a rulebook. This is about the culture you're creating here, and it's rotten. People like you, people in power, have been ignoring this problem for too long." The room felt smaller with every passing second. The weight of every word felt like it was building towards something explosive, and the Johnsons could feel it in their bones. Mrs. Johnson's heart raced as she clutched Maya's hand, trying to keep it together in front of her children. And just when it seemed like the conflict would explode, the CEO spoke again, but her voice was different now. There was no trace of the cool detachment she had shown earlier. She turned to Henry Stone with a hard stare. "I think you've said enough," she said quietly, her words ringing with a finality that caught everyone off guard. Henry Stone blinked, clearly thrown off by the shift in the CEO's tone. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice suddenly less certain. "I'm talking about doing the right thing," the CEO responded, her eyes narrowing. "You think you can control everything, but there are moments when power doesn't matter. When it's time to stand up for what's right. And right now, that means standing by this family." For the first time, Henry Stone looked unsettled, his earlier confidence slipping away. The room seemed to pulse with the mounting tension. Mrs. Johnson exchanged a quick glance with her husband, her heart racing. Could it be that the tide was finally turning? But before anyone could react, a loud crash echoed from the back of the lounge. The room jerked to attention, and everyone turned to see what had caused the noise. A pile of luggage had fallen from a cart, scattering across the floor. The distraction was enough to break the standoff, and for a split second, the focus shifted. But in that brief moment, everything changed. It wasn't just the family's dignity at stake anymore. It was a battle of power, of control, and of what would happen when two sides, so drastically different, collided in a space where no one was willing to back down. The final moments were approaching, and no one in the room could predict where the chips would fall. The loud crash of the luggage cart echoed through the lounge, momentarily cutting through the tense atmosphere. For a split second, it felt like time had frozen, the room's attention diverted to the scattered bags. But in that brief moment of chaos, something shifted within everyone present. The staff seemed to take a collective breath, as if they were all waiting for something, or someone, to make the next move. The CEO's eyes snapped toward the disturbance, but then she refocused on the situation at hand, her gaze piercing. "Enough," she said firmly, her voice now unwavering. "I'm not going to let this drag on any longer." The room went silent. Everyone's eyes were on her as she stepped forward, her posture rigid with authority. She turned to the manager, whose face had paled significantly under the weight of what was unfolding. "You'll immediately allow the Johnson family access to the lounge," she ordered, "and you will personally apologize for the way they've been treated today. Understand?" The manager nodded stiffly, his earlier confidence evaporating. It was clear that this wasn't a decision he could fight. The stakes had just become far too high, and there was no backing down now. Mrs. Johnson's breath caught in her throat. She had been bracing herself for another letdown, expecting the situation to dissolve in frustration. But now it felt like the tide was finally turning in their favor. For the first time since they'd entered the lounge, a faint glimmer of hope flickered in her chest. Henry Stone, who had been standing off to the side, his expression a mixture of disbelief and annoyance, opened his mouth to protest. But before he could speak, the CEO turned on him, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Mr. Stone," she said, her tone firm but measured, "you may think you're above this, but you are not." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. "This isn't about business. This is about people. And I won't allow your arrogance to dictate how we treat others. Not here, not today." Henry Stone's face reddened, and for the first time he looked uncertain. He opened his mouth to argue, but the CEO held up a hand, silencing him. The power dynamics were shifting in real time, and it was clear that he was no longer in control. Damon King, who had been silently watching the entire exchange, took a step forward. "This is bigger than any of us," he said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of urgency. "This moment, right now, is a turning point. It's about how we treat each other as human beings, regardless of status, race, or background. This is about standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable." The CEO nodded in agreement, then turned back to the Johnson family, offering a rare but genuine smile. "You've been treated unfairly, and for that I am truly sorry. Please, come into the lounge. You have every right to be here." Mrs. Johnson blinked, still processing the words. Her hand tightened around her husband's, and she could feel the tension slowly ebb away from her body. It wasn't just about access to the lounge anymore. It was about being seen, about being validated, about having the right to stand up and be counted. The Johnsons stepped forward, and the manager quickly moved aside, his earlier arrogance replaced with sheepish compliance. As they walked past him and into the lounge, The staff shifted uncomfortably, some of them exchanging glances with each other, as if they too were seeing the situation in a new light. But just as they were about to sit down, a sudden voice rang out from behind them. "It's not over yet." The voice was cold, sharp, one that instantly turned the room's atmosphere from triumphant to tense again. It was Henry Stone, who had pushed past the CEO and made his way toward the Johnsons with a cold, calculating look in his eyes. Everyone in the lounge turned to face him, and for a moment, it felt like the battle was far from finished. Damon immediately moved to intercept, but Henry raised a hand, signaling him to stay back. He walked directly to the Johnsons, his face now an unsettling mask of calm. "You may have gotten what you wanted today," he said, his voice low, but laced with a threat that was impossible to ignore. "But don't think this is the last time you'll be treated like this. People like you, people who think they can challenge the system, always find out that it doesn't end so easily." The tension in the room spiked again, but it was Damon who spoke this time, his voice unwavering. "You're wrong, Henry," he said. "This is just the beginning. People like you have had control for too long, but not anymore." Henry's lips twisted into a small smile, one that was more a sneer than anything else. "We'll see about that," he said, before turning on his heel and walking out of the lounge, leaving a trail of coldness in his wake. The Johnson family, still reeling from the back and forth, finally sat down in the lounge, the room still humming with the aftermath of what had just transpired. The weight of the situation hadn't fully settled yet, and the uncertainty hung in the air like a storm that hadn't fully passed. They had won today, but they knew the battle wasn't over. As Mrs. Johnson looked at her husband and children, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and wariness. What would the next challenge be? What would they face when they left the airport, when the world outside the walls of this lounge returned to the harsh realities of life? But at that moment, there was something else, a quiet but powerful realization. They had taken a stand, and that alone meant they had already won more than they had ever expected. And as the Johnsons settled into their seats, still absorbing what had just happened, Damon King exchanged a knowing glance with the CEO. There was a mutual understanding between them, one that acknowledged the long road ahead, but also the knowledge that real change, the kind that could truly make a difference, had begun today. The game was shifting, and whether Henry Stone realized it or not, this was just the first step. The lounge, once filled with tension, had now settled into an uneasy calm. The Johnson family, after everything they had endured, finally found themselves able to sit without the weight of judgment hanging over them. Mrs. Johnson took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment to savor the quiet. It was hard to believe they had made it through. Just a few hours ago, they had been treated as less than, as if they didn't belong. Now, they were finally where they had a right to be, in a space where they could feel human, valued, and respected. The children, exhausted but relieved, nestled into the plush chairs. Maya's eyes fluttered as she rested her head on her mother's shoulder, and even little Eli seemed to let go of his earlier discomfort. They were safe for now, but in the back of Mrs. Johnson's mind, a gnawing feeling lingered. She knew the fight wasn't over. Henry Stone's words echoed in her mind, the bitter reminder that this was only a small victory in a much larger battle. But as she looked at her family, she reminded herself of something. Change wasn't always immediate. Sometimes it began with moments like this, with small steps that snowballed into something greater. The CEO had stepped away after the confrontation with Henry Stone, leaving Damon King and the Johnsons alone in the lounge. She hadn't said much, but her actions had spoken volumes. The small act of granting them access to the lounge had felt like a victory, but there was still work to be done. As Damon sat beside them, he finally spoke, his voice low, but filled with a sense of finality. "You did good today," he said, his words directed toward Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. "This is only the start, but you've made an impact. This won't be forgotten." Mrs. Johnson looked at him, the weight of the day still pressing on her shoulders. "I don't know what the future holds, Damon. I wish I could say that today changed everything, but it didn't. There's still so much work to be done." Damon nodded, his expression understanding. I know. But the real change doesn't happen overnight. It takes moments like this. When people stand up for what's right, you're part of a movement now. And that matters. His words weren't just comforting. They were a reminder that progress didn't always come in the form of sweeping, immediate changes. Sometimes it came in the quiet moments of standing firm, even when the odds seemed impossible. The Johnson family sat in silence for a few moments longer, processing everything that had happened. But as they did, something remarkable began to happen. The staff members who had been quiet observers through the ordeal now began to approach. One by one, they came over to the family, each offering an apology in their own way. Some spoke directly to the Johnsons, while others simply nodded, acknowledging the wrong that had been done. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a recognition of the mistreatment, and for the first time that day, Mrs. Johnson allowed herself to feel a small sense of relief. When the time finally came to leave the lounge, the Johnson family walked out together. The airport, with its bustling crowds and overwhelming energy, seemed like a different place now. They weren't just a family looking for a quiet space. They had become part of something bigger. They had taken a stand, not just for themselves, but for countless others who had faced the same injustice. As they made their way to their gate, they passed the very staff who had initially blocked their entry. But this time, it was different. There were no cold stares, no dismissive gestures, just quiet nods, and in some cases, a kind word. The CEO, too, had reappeared on the floor, her expression more resolved than ever. She didn't say anything to the Johnsons directly, but her nod as they walked by was enough. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. She understood the significance of what had happened, and perhaps, just perhaps, this was a step toward a larger shift in how people like the Johnsons would be treated in the future. Damon stayed with them until they reached their gate, offering one last piece of advice. You don't have to change the world all at once, but every time you stand up, every time you raise your voice, you're making a difference. Don't forget that. The Johnsons thanked him, still processing the magnitude of what had just transpired. They hadn't expected any of this. All they had wanted was a place to sit, a chance to relax before their flight. But they had walked into something much larger than they could have imagined. They had walked into a story of power, prejudice, and the fight for dignity. And somehow, in the chaos of it all, they had found their place. As they boarded their flight, Mrs. Johnson sat by the window, her thoughts heavy but hopeful. She knew that challenges like this would follow them wherever they went. She knew there would be moments when they would feel like giving up, like stepping back into the shadows. But she also knew that they had already begun something important, a shift, a movement, a fight for what was right. And that was enough. It was enough to carry with them, to remind them that, even in the face of adversity, they were not alone. Others would follow. Others would rise, and the fight for equality and dignity would never end. As the plane took off, the city below shrinking beneath them, the Johnson family looked ahead to the future, uncertain, yes, but filled with the promise of change. And in that moment, they knew that their story wasn't over. It was only just beginning.